Vasudendra, Mr. Arvind Naren, and Ms. Meenal Hajratwala. The moderator for this session is Mr. Danish Sheikh. Ms. Nalini Rajan is Dean of Studies and Professor, Asian College of Journalism, Chennai. She has written 3 works of fiction, 4 on political philosophy, and edited 5 works on media studies. She is a general editor of the series on studies and journalism. Mr. Vasudendra is a Kannada author famous for his short stories. Written in simple language and simple style, each story conveys much deeper meanings. He has captured the essence of life, which is changing rapidly by advent of globalization and rise of software industry in India. Mr. Arvind Naren, a founder member of the Alternative Law Forum, was actively involved in working on child rights and juvenile justice at the NLSIU Center for the Child and the Law. He also taught courses at the NLSIU on human rights law and ideology, ethnic conflict, law, poverty and development. He divides his time between litigation on the criminal side and research and advocacy on sexuality and minority-related issues. Ms. Meenal Hajratwala's latest book is Bountiful Instructions for Enlightenment. She is a writing coach, author of the award-winning Leaving India, My Family's Journey from 5 Villages to 5 Continents, and editor of Out, Stories from the New Queer India. Mr. Danish Sheikh works at the Alternative Law Forum, conducting research and advocacy relating to gender and sexuality law and free speech. He is also collaborating on an anthologized novel titled Invisible Libraries, due for publication later this year. Over to you, panelists.
Hi, so first things first, as you can see, we only have 3 panelists. Nalini unfortunately could not make it. She was going to join us here from Chennai, and due to recent events that was not possible. So just by way of introduction, before I start asking our panelists questions. Panel is called 377 Stories. And so it's called that because in some ways this all comes back to the law. Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which criminalizes carnal intercourse against the order of nature. For 150 years, this law cast the lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender community in the garb of unapprehended criminals. It gave legitimacy to LGBT oppression, whether it was in the form of blackmail, police brutality, discrimination at the institutional level, or simply the idea of being a second-rank citizen in the eyes of the law. Then the Delhi High Court judgment passed the Nas Foundation judgment on the 2nd of July 2009, which decriminalized homosexuality and galvanized the movement in India. The legal victory was taken away from us on the 11th of December 2013 when the Supreme Court of India overturned the judgment, essentially saying that there was no constitutional harm in depriving LGBT individuals of their fundamental rights since they were a minuscule minority, and here I quote the judgment. Now, the law does many things. It is a powerful force. It's one of the ways in which we constitute ourselves, right? Because constitutions, as you say, embody the values of a polity, and we constitute ourselves through those values as well. So, but there are other lenses through which we and our ideas about the world are composed, and one of the most powerful ones is literature. So in Because I Have a Voice, which was one of the first anthologies of gay writing in India, co-edited by Gautam Bhan and one of my panelists here, Arvind Narayan, the introduction notes a certain moment of realization that comes in the life of a queer person. And it says, there's a moment that comes when we realize that the world isn't exactly designed for people like us. And it's a profoundly lonely moment. And it's a moment where we scrounge and we scavenge for stories. Right? So we take the books we read and we change the gender of the protagonist, we read between lines, we find spaces between cracks. Anything to see that somewhere, somehow there is a mirror to our reality. So what this lovely little extract tells me, amongst many other things, is that stories are important. right? Queer accounts are essential. Queer writing is intrinsically political. Now the question of what constitutes queer writing is a contested one. So, does it hinge on the identity of the author? Is it about the narrative involving certain queer characters? Or is it something, is it possibly something broader to say that we might queer a work without explicitly talking about characters, but is queerness maybe a possibility of, say, form and function? So these and many other questions are things that we will deal with over the course of this panel. We had a very good job of introducing my panelists, but I just like to just tell you a little bit about them because this is one of the rare panels where the moderator has actually had the privilege of having personal relationships with all the panelists. So now Vasudendra is a Kannada author and he's famous for his short stories. His most recent collection though is Mohan Swami, that's right. And so I had the privilege of reading a translated version of his stories, and they just completely bowled me over. And this just happened over the course of the last month. There's a certain kind of, I think, empathy and a kind of force that he brings to the narrative that's just, yeah. So anyway, thank you for being here. And then we have Meenal Harshitwala. Now, Meenal's first book, Leaving India, is a completely staggering work that, she follows the story of an immigrant family across 5 continents, and it's also a sneak account of her coming out journey. Her second book was the first anthology of queer writing after Delhi High Court judgment, and that was Out Stories from the New Queer India. And now Meenal is an excellent writer. What you may not know is that she's also a great editor. So I've had the privilege again of having one of my stories edited by her, and she's wonderfully generous, I think, and that's really difficult. That's really hard word to find for an editor, but that's really her quality of giving you advice and guidance through a draft. So her latest book is Bountiful Instructions for Enlightenment, and this is a collection of poetry and performance pieces. They look at a range of themes from identity, spirituality, to things as light as the catastrophes facing the modern world. Arun Narayan is someone who I have interned with in the past and is now a colleague of mine at the Alternative Law Forum. He has, as I mentioned earlier, co-edited Because I Have a Voice, the queer anthology. This was preceded by a monograph called Queer, and this was followed by another co-edited collection which was called Law Like Love, which looked at the changing legal and activist landscape following the Delhi High Court judgment. Now, like I said, Arvind's a lawyer, and he's been an important figure in the LGBT movement for, I suppose, almost 2 decades now, so now you know how old he is. Yeah, so my first question is to Arvind, and so I think it'd be great if you could just give us a little more on the journey of the law. So we often talk about NAS Foundation as this beacon, as this landmark judgment. So how did it come to be that way, and how did the movement, how did the community make it the landmark that it is today?
Thanks. Thanks, Tanish, for that warm introduction. And I think the question which we ask ourselves is, what am I, as a lawyer, doing in a forum of literary people? What does the law have to bring to the life of literature? And the submission I have to make is, at points in time, I know you guys might distrust me, at points in time, the law can contribute a lot towards precisely the task that literature contributes to, which is the task of making people who might not seem completely human, fully human. And I think I want to illustrate this with reference to the 2009 judgment of the Delhi High Court, where they decriminalized what in technical lawyerly language is called same-sex acts between adults in private. But I think the life of the law goes really far beyond this decriminalizing same-sex acts of adults in private. What the law did is give us, in a sense, a new language, which is what literature at its best often does. What I mean by this is very simply this. Even if you ask people who are normally supportive of LGBT rights, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people's rights, the line you'll get from them often is to say that, I really support you guys. What you do in your bedroom is, end of the day, your business. We support you fully. And our point, our response to that very often is, is that really good enough? Do you really understand what it means to be LGBT beyond the question of supporting my rights to be who I am in my bedroom? And on this particular question, what the Nurse Foundation judgment did is gave us a new language. The judges basically said, your sexuality is something which travels with you wherever you go. So the point they were making is being LGBT is not limited to the question of the bedroom. It's a part of your life. It's a part of your identity. It's a part of who you are. So in its broadest and its deepest sense, what the Nurse Foundation judgment told us is that LGBT people are full citizens of India. They have the right to autonomy, and they have in a deepest sense what you would call the right to express themselves through intimate acts of attachment with other people, right? And that to me is giving a profound meaning through the words of the law, as it were. So in a sense, I mean, if I were to give you my personal introduction, the reason why I say I am here is because I think both the law and the literature can at points in time be profoundly humanizing forces. They can tell you that people you might fear, people you might deride, or people you might despise are actually people with loves and lives, quite like your own as well. So that's really, in a sense, in a very short and very briefly, what the Delhi High Court judgment 2009 did, and what to me, law at its best can possibly do.
Thanks, Arvind. So I think Arvind's given us a very good idea of the legal force of the Delhi High Court judgment, what the law means for us. And Meenal, as I mentioned, was responsible for editing the first anthology of short stories of queer writing after the Delhi High Court judgment came out. It's titled Out, Stories from the New Queer India. So I think the stories reflect a very important point in the movement, because they come in this interesting 4-year space, right, between the Delhi High Court judgment and the Supreme Court judgment. So I think, what do you think those stories tell us about the shape of the movement at that time, or queer lives in India? I think just be great to hear from you. Yeah.
Thank you. So I feel in a very personal way very indebted to you and all the other lawyers who worked on the judgment, because it made a huge difference, and it was really the impetus for putting out that collection called Out. And it came at a moment when I think we all felt so optimistic about the future, and it seemed like that was going to be the ushering in of a whole new era. And so the purpose of that collection was really to document, not in a kind of, true life story like, what is your life like, what is your life like, but to, in the imaginative space of queer writers, it felt like the first moment when we could, as queer Indians, imagine being full citizens and could tell stories that took place in that moment itself, and also projected forward into the future. So, when I think about what the law has to do with our lives as queer Indians, one thing that occurs to me is that, of course, our lives have always existed, right? And there's a lot of sort of historical excavation of the fact that various forms of same-sex relationships have existed. And at the same time, the nature of that story is dramatically different. So if I am telling the story of my relationship with my wife, that is very different if we are criminals versus if we are citizens and fully recognized. And those are two completely different stories, just as if you're telling the story of your relationship, but your relationship is coded in a way that you have to keep it secret from everybody, that's a completely different story than if that same emotional attachment and relationship happened, but you were able to tell everybody in your life joyfully about it. So that is the moment that we were really interested in capturing with the Out anthology, and looking at, okay, now that we have this space that's been opened up by the law, how far can our imaginations go in fiction in many different directions? And so some of them were really realistic stories, some of them were very sort of, there was like a crime noir story. There was Danish's beautiful piece which opens the book, which is really the story of a young man falling in love at the same time as a young law student falling in love at the same time as the court judgment is unfolding over several months. And there are also some futuristic stories in the book about, what if we were, in the space age on a rocket ship, and then there's, somebody fell in love with somebody else of the same gender, and how would that unfold? So I'm really interested in not just contemporary realistic stories, but also the imaginative space, which I hope that although the Supreme Court decision reversed that Delhi High Court decision, it's very difficult to put the imagination back into a box. And so, although there's a way in which the anthology is a little bit now outdated because it took place in that window, but I think the imaginative space that we're able to occupy as queer people that opened up is not so easily closed back up.
So, Arvind, let's talk about the Supreme Court judgment for a bit, right? So, NAS Foundation gives us moral citizenship, and then in 2013, the Supreme Court with Kaushal takes that away. So, can you give us an insight into some of the myriad weaknesses that one might garner to the Kaushal judgment? And what do you think it might have done to the LGBT movement of India? Where do we stand presently? Yeah.
I think I began by saying what a wonderful thing the law is. Now I think I need to get to the other point and say what a horrible thing the law can be. And I say horrible in some sense of an activist perspective. But I think the person who captured it most poetically and most beautifully is actually Vikram Seth, when he said, the day of the Supreme Court judgment is a bad day for law and love. Why it's a bad day for love, I think we know. For the simple reason, what the judgment does is it embodies or conceptualizes LGBT persons as nothing more than a series of body parts engaging in certain kind of sexual acts. And our entire point has always been that LGBT persons are full moral citizens, entitled to all rights under the Indian Constitution, including the right to love without restriction, as it were. And this is precisely what the judgment denies LGBT persons by saying that you are a minuscule minority in this country, and hence you're not entitled to challenge the laws of this land. Which takes me to the second part of Vikram Seth's marvelous point, which is why is it a bad day for law? It's a bad day for law because it's a bad example of legal reasoning in terms of the way they argue out the case on Article 14, Article 15, Article 21. I won't bore you with the legalities of that. I'm going to take you to two other reasons why I think it's a bad day for law. Firstly, if you think of it, the idea of law or constitutional principles of law is the fact that it has a certain duty in the Indian context. The idea of a legal framework, constitutional framework, in a diverse, plural, and hierarchical society like India is to ensure that the Supreme Court steps in to protect minority rights against the interests of the majority. We live in a constitutional democracy. We don't live in a majoritarian democracy. So clearly, it is the responsibility of the Supreme Court to step in and say that if a majority opinion is against a despised and unpopular minority, and to protect that minority against the ravages of a majority opinion. That the court failed to do. And the second failure might be somewhere linked to, once again, the question of literature. Because when we think of judges, what should the responsibility of a judge be? In some ways, you can think of a speech in Merchant of Venice, where the argument is, you're talking about justice tempered with mercy. So in this case, is there justice? Is there mercy? Is the question one chooses to ask. If you take the same point back to the Constituent Assembly debates, there's a marvelous speech by Nehru, they call it Tryst with Destiny, where he makes the point, referring to Gandhi. He says the ambition of the greatest man that ever lived of this generation was to wipe every tear from every eye. He says, we may not achieve that high water mark, but that is the objective we set ourselves. So in my submission, I think the responsibility of judges is really, beyond everything else, to wipe every tear from every eye. And clearly in this case what the judges did is they ignored the tears which were before them. And once again, I don't want to quote the affidavits, but there were two really powerful and moving affidavits filed, one by a transgender person called Kokila, where she testified to repeated rape at the hands of the police. This is a testimony which was read out in court. The other is a testimony read out by a mother of a gay person who said that she finds it offensive to live in a country where a son is treated like a second-class citizenship, and she finds it very difficult to enjoy your right to family life when at every point in time you're afraid that your family could be intruded upon by the police. So in a sense, it's these stories of pain and suffering which the judges ignored, as it were. So I think I'll just end by saying that the Supreme Court judgment, as Vikram Seth most eloquently put it, was a bad day for law and love. And again, the person who captured it really well, and the person we'd have been very keen on hearing, is actually in the other panel, which is Neera Seth. And she did a marvelous open letter on the day of the judgment, after the judgment, which basically captured the agony and pain of a mother having a gay son, as it were, you know, which talked about what it means to criminalize a person because of the fact that he chooses to love someone of the same gender. So really, that's what the Supreme Court judgment did. And where do we go from here is the question which Danish is asking. And maybe just respond in 2-3 lines, and we won't take much more time on that. Just to say that, sure, it's a difficult time in terms of the fact that the law is against us at present. But we see a lot of hope in the fact that there are more and more discussions happening in places around the country. Day before yesterday, I was in a small town called Kannur, where we had a big discussion on the entire issue of 377. And there have been multiple discussions and conversations which are happening around the country. So in a strange and paradoxical kind of way, what the law has enabled, what a bad law has enabled, is the flowering of a resistance in opposition to it. And in a sense, I want to end this last point by quoting a black American gay poet who I'm very fond of quoting very often, called Langston Hughes. He says, what happens to dreamed effort? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Does it run like stinking meat? Or does it explode? So in answer to Danish's question, my submission is really that this dream of full moral citizenship for LGBT persons is poised to explode.
So yes, in some ways the law has failed us. In some ways it's also paradoxically opened up spaces to contest, to speak. And literature really is one of these modes. And now I want to ask Vasudendra here about, you write in Kannada. So can you tell us about how Kannada literature has so far looked at the idea of sexuality?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks, Danish. But in Kannada, I do not see a major writing by anybody with respect to the LGBT kind of a relationship. But here and there are passing references, which is interesting actually. But one thing I can observe is very clearly, almost all the writers have characterized that gay relation person with a homophobia. Starting from the Jnanapita Award winner, Shivram Karant, they have always seen it very negatively. Okay? So in fact, it's so negative. If you want to highlight a person as a very bad person, he is a very wicked, he is a villain, and also they will add a gay character to it. That's the way they have been written. In fact, it's in the Jnanapita Award book, Mukherjee at Nisugadu, Shivram Karant ends the novel saying that that's the height of the bad way a man can go, is the gay sex. That's the way he concludes that novel. It's very sad. But in fact, even some of them very shy to even express that. For example, Girish Karnad's autobiography, which has come very recently. What he wants to quote is, like, people were confused that I'm a gay, I had a relationship with someone, a noted journalist, but he wants to prove a point that I'm not. Okay, in one way it's fine, that's fine. He's trying to defend himself, though I'm not related to anything to that. But what is very interesting is, with all these things, there are some voices here and there. Okay, so they are very promising. Masti wrote a story long back, very, very long back, I think 1936 or 38, like that. There, he supports that relationship. But supporting in such a way that when you do not have any alternatives, when you do not have any options, in a forced way, you can have a sex with a man, So a man can have a sex with man, but that can be excusable. It's nothing criminal in it, is what he has said. But other than that, I do not see so much of a reference to the, especially lesbian and all, you don't see it at all. Only the gay relations have come in Kannada. Only person who was good about it is Lankesh. Lankesh is the one who says, I can accept that. Though he says I was very homophobic in the beginning, it was very difficult. Actually, he travels with a person, okay? And everyone knows around that there is a thing saying that this person is a gay person. But surprisingly for in that seminar actually, wherever they booked the hotel, for both of them, they booked the same hotel room. So Lankesh gets very scared, like what's going to happen? What is this guy going to do with me? The whole night, the Lankesh will not sleep. But what he understands is, the person who was sleeping with me, he will have a sound sleep, and in the morning he gets up and greets him, how are you? So then he says, I think I'm totally wrong. I had to come out of this homophobia, and I can accept it as normal as anything else, is what he concludes in his autobiography. That's the only positive thing which can look for it. But now, recently, the trend is building up. People are writing here and there. So one novel has come, many short stories are coming up. So it's quite a lot.
And you're one of the pioneers of this kind of writing, and so that's what makes your work so important. And so I wanted you to talk a little more about that, because one of the things that you do, of course, is Mohan Swami is a very sympathetic gay protagonist. And it's not just that, but he has this wonderfully non-judgmental way of how he comes across ideas of queerness also. So there's this one story where he's getting blackmailed by this person, and it's about how he stands up for himself. There's another story where he's engaging with this transgender classmate of his, who then later commits suicide, and again that's a very powerful account. So I think one thing that I want to know is what kinds of reactions you get from your audience. What kinds of audience does your work reach out to?
I had a difficult time actually, so when I wrote this book, it's definitely very, very new, fresh for the Kannada readers, especially this kind of a stories. They have never imagined it comes from me, because I'm writing from almost 20 years, okay, and I had written at various subjects, so luckily they were all big hit, like, so I have a big readership crowd. So they were all expecting similar kind of stories will come from me. So when these stories came, so various reactions were there. So one thing was there, so maybe two reactions if I said it will be fantastic. I think a doctor from somewhere from Dharwad, he said, I hate you for writing these stories. What was the need for writing such stories, such a vulgar stories, why did you write? There's no such vulgarity in my stories, but he was considering it as vulgar. Why did you write such vulgar stories? Okay, that's one reaction. But the second reaction was very interesting, which I thought it almost a 70 plus old man from Mysore. He told me he's married and he has got 2 kids, but he's a queer. So he said, if you had written me this book 30 years back, my life would have been very different. My life, I would not have gone through this suffering which I went through all these years. It would have been very different. Why didn't you write 30 years back, is what he asked me. Okay, so I think these two reactions will hold together, put the responses which I got to various, some hate mails also, some started crying also, why did you write like this, the crying also is there, all kind of.
Right, and I think another thing that's quite remarkable that one notices in the stories is also this very sort of reaching out to very traditional kinds of metaphors of sexuality, there's something very Indian. And one thing that I noticed in one of your stories is this moment where Mohan Swami again has been rejected by his lover, and he's seeking solace in religion, and he kisses the idol of Krishna. And so I was wondering what you thought about, in some ways you're going back. There's something very traditional about this account, because it's taking us back to this idea of the very symbiotic linkages between religion and sexuality. And so what are your thoughts on that?
When I actually, especially Mohan Swami is fond of the Lord Krishna, he almost considers him as a lover. Okay, like he fantasizes him even having sex with Krishna in that story. Yeah. So why I went is, I have seen Meera has shows the similar kind of love towards Krishna. Here in Kannada, we have Vachanakaras. In that, Akka Mahadevi shows similar kind of love towards Channa Mallikarjuna. So why not our Mohan Swami can have love relationship with Lord Krishna? So that's the thing which I bought. And also I had observed one more thing, since you said the religion, I had a temple in my native place. He's a very beautiful God. He's a beautiful God, but he never allows women to enter his temple. Also, there is another kind of belief there. A woman who is very young, still not reached the maturity, she can enter. Or woman who has already passed on one kind of period, so she can enter. So why is this God is behaving in this way? Why is he refusing to visit of a girl whom he can marry, kind of a thing? So that was always bothering to me. So that was always coinciding with the queer nature of any individual. So maybe that could be the reason is also. So in another story of mine, so I have got that reference also. So religion is always that, I'm not a scholar in talking about more on the religion side, but I have read Mahabharata in full depth. What really surprised me in Mahabharata is there are so many references where the LGBT issues comes there as well. But Vyasa never takes the tone of a surprise or astonishing tone that something is happening here like this. He never takes that kind of a tone. Just like Arjuna married to Draupadi, he talks about another person having a sex with the same sex person. So that kind of a controlled language there which he uses, it gives me an indication that it was considered as quite normal during those days. So those are the things which I can quote as a references to the religion and mythology.
And Meenal, you are adding to this archive, right? Because in your latest collection, you have this remarkable account of the story of the goddess of AIDS. And so I don't want to spoil this for the audience. I'm going to let you talk about it in your words. But yeah, I'd love them to hear more about what the goddess of AIDS is and where you heard the story from.
So many years ago, actually, when I was in San Francisco, living there, I read in a paper the story of this village in Karnataka where there was this man who had been kind of run out of the village because he had HIV. And this was early years of the epidemic. This was around 99. So, people didn't necessarily understand what it was, how it was transmitted, etc. And so during this time, there was a teacher in the village. And what this teacher did was he took a murti of Ardhanarishwar and he made it in a sort of small handmade temple. And he took some kumkum and he painted the words HIV on the forehead of this deity and set it up as a temple. Where people could come and, worship and pray for good health and all that kind of thing. So I was really amazed by this because sometimes in the West we have this idea that, the West is like progressive and advanced and then other places maybe don't know how to handle things. And I just thought this was such a beautiful, creative act. And so one of the things that I was working on at that time was a series of performance pieces in which I was becoming various gods and goddesses and trying to recruit the audience into my cult. I don't know if you remember, but around the turn of 2000, there were a lot of these millennium cults because people thought the world was going to end. And so I thought, why don't I start some cults myself? So one of these deities was the goddess of AIDS based on this character. And so based on this newspaper clipping, and so as that character, I got up on stage and I told people they should fight the demon, and then, who's the demon? Oh, the demon is this little virus, and only you have the power to stop it. So that was sort of my idea for that. But I love the idea of, all of our texts being very accessible to all of us. And so the idea that this little, village school teacher could remake it into a story that was useful to his community at that time, and then that I could remake it into a story that was useful to my community at that time, gives me a sense of excitement to know that the sacred texts are not so fixed. They have a lot of space and flexibility in them, and that's what I'm excited about, is how queerness can really, open up some imaginative space, even for non-queer people.
The statement that you told me in one of our correspondences, when you said you were interested in the possibility of how a queer lens or queer perspective can expand all imagination, right? And I thought, that's an interesting kind of response to this thing of, the queer writing ghetto. So I think just a little more from you on that.
Yeah, so, and I feel like for me as a writer, the most useful place for me to position myself is sort of as an outsider-insider. So with my book on the diaspora and how migration happened out of India over the last 100 years and through the characters in my family, I obviously had a very insider perspective as a second-generation American whose family came from India several generations ago. But at the same time, because of being queer, I was an outsider to my own community. And so I could see them with a kind of different lens that perhaps is more objective or more neutral than if I was fully steeped in that community and living completely by its own values and terms. And for me, that is the queer position, is actually on that border where we are part of societies, but something also gives us, in a sort of mystical sense, you could say it's a third eye, or just some kind of alternate perspective, because a story that is fully told from the inside is often actually really hard to access. If you're using terminology that only people inside a community know, you might not be able to reach your story outside that community. So just as a writer, I find it really helpful to be in this kind of queer place with a lot of different issues, and really kind of break open what is the commonly accepted story.
So, I think this final thought goes out to all of you, and you feel to respond in whatever way you might want. But so, when you mentioned this Vikram Seth quote, right? So, this being a bad day for law and love, Kaushal, the Supreme Court judgment being a bad day for law and love, and when we think of it as a bad day for love, we think of it as a bad day for queer love, right? Because we say, okay, so what the judgment did was it criminalized LGBT sex. Right, so this is why it is a bad day for love. But is it possible that it was a bad day for love in general? Is it possible that queer love has a transformative potential on how we relate to intimacy generally? And if so, what is that potential? So I think
When you say bad day for love generally, I would go with that line of thinking. Mainly because if you look at section 377, what it criminalizes is what it calls carnal intercourse against the order of nature. And so really the question is, as far as the Indian context is concerned, what is the order of nature? And the human rights work which we've been doing over the last couple of years indicates that the order of nature in the Indian context includes love across lines of caste and religion. If you see what happened in Pramod Mutalik's attacks, you see the fact that Hindu-Muslim love relationships are now being targeted under the guise of what is being called love jihad. Very clearly, the idea of what is natural love in the Indian context is very, very narrow. It's within the context of heterosexual arranged marriage alone. So if you have a love marriage across lines of caste and religion, you often run the risk of being killed for it. That's the risk you could run, especially along lines of caste and religion. So a simple submission would be, what is queer about love in the Indian context clearly is all these relationships which question the idea of what is normal. And in the context of India, what is normal are lines of caste, religion, gender and sexuality. And the range of people who are questioning this are all frontiersmen who are opening out the borders of what we actually mean by love. So I think in a sense the horizon we all want to get towards is a horizon which says there should be a love to love across boundaries of caste, religion, sexuality and gender. And that really is the horizon, if you want to call it, of queer love.
Yeah, I definitely agree with, that beautiful analysis, and also that what was, as I understand it, criminalized was these particular acts, which are often interpreted to mean anal sex and sometimes oral sex, which obviously are things that heterosexual people also partake in. So that's one aspect, and also that, my experience as being sort of an LGBT person, an activist, and someone engaged in these conversations over many years, is that LGBT issues are often a litmus test for a kind of the general way that society is going. So, people who are against queer rights are typically against also women's equality and interreligious, interclass kind of things, and things like abortion. So we don't really know, where this edge is, but there is a whole cluster of right-wing agenda items, and LGBT is really only one item in that list. So I think we can, take a look around the world at different countries and see where they stand on LGBT issues, and that is a pretty decent gauge of the overall state of the progressive or liberal mindset of that country. And I think that is why I was really heartened to see after this Supreme Court decision that a whole range of groups actually came out in coalition against the decision. And you did see certain feminist groups, women's groups, and other kinds of coalitions really, saying this is not the kind of country, this is not the kind of India that we believe in. We believe in an India that is more inclusive and more tolerant than this.
For me, it's very simple, Danish. If it is a bad day for love, then it is bad for everything else in life. You don't have to exclusively say bad day for love. The whole society responsibility, including the legal system, including the political system, including every system which we have, is to protect the love, whatever the format it is in. So if you are not protecting the love, if it is a bad day for love, it's bad day for everything else, and it's an insult for that society.
Thank you. So the Bangalore Lit Fest runs on a tight schedule, part of which means I'm going to have to end this part of the conversation. We'll open it up for audience questions. We can take up to 2 questions. So going once, going twice. Okay. 2 of you.
I'm Dr. Lakshmi Priya. I'm a writer. You said it's bad day for love or something like that, but most of the time in the Indian scenario, the caste systems are dominating one of the other life, and the upper caste and the lower caste. An example last year that a lower caste guy was in love with an upper caste girl, and that became highly politically motivated. And whether he was murdered or not murdered, that has become, at the end of the day, it became the bad situation. It became that. It created an unnatural death of that guy. So what do you think about it?
No, we completely agree with you on what you're saying. Because our point is simply this. I think what all 3 panelists have been trying to say is that when you say queer love, our point is not to restrict it to the LGBT community alone. Clearly, in the Indian context, we have to take on board the fact that the idea of questioning the idea of the natural includes people precisely like cases generate, people who fall in love across lines of caste and lines of religion. And clearly the world you want is a world where all these forms of love can flourish. And when you say a bad day for love, for us it's a bad day for love in this broader sense.
Yeah, I mean, I came of age in a political movement where queer did not actually mean that we're just like you. queer meant that we are ready to look at the roots of what is considered normal and overturn that. And I think that one reason that LGBT issues are seen as such a threat is that once you really interrogate the question of who is allowed to love whom, then all of these other societal structures do come into question naturally, right? Because if we say, okay, this man is allowed to love this man, then we will naturally say, well, why isn't this woman from supposedly low caste allowed to love this man from supposedly high caste, or vice versa? And I think that we need to reframe the conversation around all of these issues in a legal sense around consent. And I think that's what really the progressive, legal movements are trying to do. When it comes to sexuality, the one and only arbiter should be, is it consent? And even if it's in a marriage that is legally recognized, if there is no consent, that should not be a legal sex act. And even if it's outside a marriage between two adults of any stripe, if it is consent, that should be a legally allowed act. And I don't see why, it needs to be really more complicated than that. That is the way that a neutral and egalitarian society would structure its law, and that it would also, and by law there is, kind of this overarching national law that we have, but also the law of the panchayat, right? All these the law of the religions, all these local micro laws and cultural norms, which sometimes are even stronger laws, right? The rules, the informal rules that our communities enforce, those sometimes are even stronger than whatever is on the legal books. So I think that when we move toward, okay, how do we want sexuality to be regulated, if we can really keep this one idea, this single idea of consent in mind, that will clarify the path of what we understand to be right.
Hi, my name is Ravi. The question is I'm just trying to understand how it really works. See, if you just talk about sex, it's all scientific, it's all natural and all that. There is some kind of hormones working all there and all that. But in case of LGBT, is it really natural or how does it come? All questions finally roots there, right? So if it was really natural, then how come this question has not come so far? Till now, there is no work in Kannada literature because there are no issues like that. Or is it really suppressed till now and now it is suddenly coming up or something like that? A sex with an animal is completely unnatural. Well, we are just trying to understand how does it really is natural and how scientifically it is. There is a point there. I'm just trying to understand and then going around that.
No, I'm very excited to answer this question because, I'm looking at this tree here, and I don't know if you can see it, but you can turn and look at this tree. And this tree has these beautiful lights coming down. It is completely unnatural. Completely unnatural. And in fact, when you go to some kirana shop and you pick up your potato chips, your Lay's potato chips in a packet, that is also completely unnatural food, chock full of preservatives. It is not what our great-grandforefathers ate. And even what they ate was cooked, right? So we as human beings are cultural. We're not natural. And we have control over what our culture is and does.
The question is about the nature, definition of natural. I didn't mean in that way. What I meant in natural way is is it something forced or is it really comes from the origin? Okay, I want to have a gay sex or something like that. I want to have a relation of that kind with a guy. Does it come from within or how is it? That's what I meant by natural.
Alright, so we'll have Vasu answering this.
So you know that the LGBT people are not treated well in the society. You very much know about it. Do you think anyone will purposefully go and claim that I am a gay, I am a lesbian like that to get punished from the society if it is not natural? Okay, so what is natural? How do you say that you are having a sex with a woman is natural? Because that's how you have grown up. It's not a choice. You didn't take it up one day that today onwards I'll have a sex with women only. It happened to you naturally. Like that it happens to a gay person as well. So there is no question of what is natural here. So that's your definition. And also you said that it didn't come in the literature, that's because it was not natural. Dalit literature also didn't come for a long time in Kannada. So what do you say about that? What we have not spoken, we need to speak about it. Then only the literature will have its value.
One more question.
Minal, good evening. My question was to understand which village were you referring to, and what's the name of the village, number one. Was it imaginative or was it existing still in play? And then Vasundhara, sir, apart from Shikandi and
Vasudhendra.
Sorry. Thank you. Okay. Apart from Shikandi and Arjuna, is there any other character which is highlighted? I would like you to tell those names. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I don't know the name of the village. Even the original newspaper clipping that I read did not name the village. And so I don't also know, this was in 1999 that I read it. So I also don't know whether this continues to carry on or not.
Last question.
It was from the Associated Press. It was a wire service story that I read in the United States.
Last question. Last question.
There's one more answer.
So you said about other than the Shikandi and the Arjunas becoming finally. I think I'm not scholar, but what I would suggest is you read a book which has come from Devdutt Patnaik recently called Shikandi and Other Stories. He has covered all possible LGBT relations in the mythology. One I can immediately quote about is Bhagirath. Bhagirath doesn't have a father. He's born out of two women. Okay, so that's a story. That's a Bhagirath. So if you take the Sanskrit word also, that's what it says. He's born out of two women, and no man is involved in it, is what the Purana says. So that refers to the lesbian relationship which was there in the Purana's time as well. Okay.
Last question.
The organizers are standing there. I'm just going to ask them. Can we take these questions? Do we have time? Okay, so one last question. Oh, you arm wrestle it out. Okay, the woman. Meenal says.
It's okay. We would share how one question. Go ahead, no problem. You can go ahead. After that.
Hi. So I've just been I've just been kind of confused about this for a little while. So the idea of like the term LGBT, I'm not really sure where it came from, but it seems like it has a very different origin than the identity that you described in your story of the man who feels like he has who feels like Krishna is his lover. Like, I just want to know, like, what you think of this distinction between the identity of like LGBT, which seems to be a very modern or whatever Western term or idea, and the identity that this man feels towards Krishna. Like, it's, am I making sense? Like, I feel like they come, like, they're very different, like they're very different ideas in some sense, but kind of in the same space in a lot of ways. Like, can you, like, is this distinction relevant? Like, how do you kind of marry them and make them both, you know, because, like, for example, I might identify as someone from the LGBT community as whatever, a 22-year-old today, but I might not identify with a woman in that position towards a female goddess, you know, several hundred years ago. Like, I'm just.
So that's a belief you have that several years back it wasn't there. That's a belief you have. But we are talking about already the Puranas, Bharata, Mahabharata, everywhere where it has been quoted. It's nothing to do with the modernity. Okay? So what really, maybe if I give some one incident which I come across recently, you will really understand what's the suffering actually which goes on there. See, one of my a friend, he's from Andhra Pradesh, okay? He told me one thing. Though his father was encouraging a lot for the education. He was stressing that there is a need for the education, you should become an engineer and all. But after PUC, he came out to his father saying that he's gay. You know what was he said? I should not have told my father about this. So I asked him why. Because he said, my father lost interest in investing in my education later on because I don't get married and I don't get the dowry. Right? So how it is, there's no question of any of the ancient literature or modernity or best lifestyle. Nothing is related. It's our day-to-day life. How a lack of love to an individual can turn into so many vague things. Very, very harsh things it gets turned out. Okay, so that should be sufficient. I don't think we need to really look whether it was there 700 years back or not. It is there today, so we need to accept.
So to sum up this panel, okay. So this panel will be summed up in 2 minutes.
I wanted to thank you for that question and just say that, you know, I agree the language is very imperfect, and in fact we don't have good words for a lot of our inner feelings of, you know, regardless of gender, but many, you know, in certain ages maybe this kind of person would be called a bhakti rather than a gay person, for example. And so I think that what this question points to is something I think about a lot, which is how important it is to actually tell individual stories rather than just sort of stick a label on something, but to really open up the space for very unique personal stories so that we can understand the range of human experience.
Okay, now I'm getting really worried looks from the organizer, so I want to do the long summary. Short summary is air conditioning is unnatural and David Beckham is a Western import, but we love both of them, so why not the gays? No, okay, that's not really my summing up. I know, right? No, so just before this panel, I was busy losing a quiz at the book show. This thing. And so one of the few questions that me and my esteemed teammate and co-panelist got right was this one from an Auden poem. And so, you know, Auden could really write the manual on queer love or law and love, and he has, in fact. And so just one line from him really to walk away with, and that's just, we must love one another or die. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you panelists for the wonderful session. I request the panelists to please sign the BLF board. There is specially customized BLF merchandise available at the help desk. This includes t-shirts and bags. Please support us in bringing BLF to you year after year. We have a session on A Country Gagged and Bound, where the panelists are Arun Shori, Girish Karnal, Shubha Mughal, Siddharth Dhanwan Sangvi, Joe D. Cruz, Rajiv Malhotra, Swapan Das Gupta, Sanskran Thakur and Asha Sattar at Stage 1, Samskara. Well, this is it from Suragi. We are honored to have such eminent personalities. We hope to see you all at the Bangalore Literature Festival next year. Thank you so much.